too, can lead to feelings of isolation. Let's look at a modern-day example. Imagine you're an athlete training for the Olympics. While your friends are out enjoying their weekends, eating whatever they want, and relaxing, you're up early every morning, training rigorously, eating a strict diet, and disciplining yourself for the goal ahead. You can't afford to live like everyone else because your calling is different. You're aiming for something higher, and that requires sacrifice. As C.S. Lewis observed, there is no safe investment. To love at all is to be vulnerable. The sacrifice you make in pursuing your calling makes you vulnerable to loneliness, but it is a necessary step toward greatness. The same is true in our spiritual lives. When you choose to live a life of integrity, faith, and obedience to God, it often separates you from others. The world doesn't always value these traits. In fact, people may even mock you or distance themselves from you because they don't share your commitment. But just like the Olympic athlete, you know that the reward is worth the sacrifice. Think about Moses. God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, but it wasn't an easy calling. He faced resistance from the very people he was trying to help. He had to confront Pharaoh, lead a nation through the wilderness, and deal with constant complaints and rebellion. Yet, despite the challenges, Moses remained faithful to the high standard God had set for him. His loneliness wasn't a sign of failure. It was a sign of leadership. In our modern context, you might find yourself in a similar situation. Maybe you're a young person committed to living a life of purity in a culture that promotes the opposite. Or maybe you're a business leader who refuses to cut ethical corners, even though it costs you financially. These high standards can make you feel isolated, but remember, they're part of what sets you apart for greatness. C.S. Lewis once remarked, "Integrity is doing the right thing, even when no one is watching." And it is often in this unseen commitment to our values that loneliness can grow, but it is also where character is forged. Jesus himself modeled this for us. He lived a life of perfection, holding himself to the highest standard, even when it meant standing alone. In the Garden of Gethsemane, as he faced the cross, he was alone, abandoned by his closest friends. Yet, in that moment of solitude, he surrendered fully to God's will. His loneliness led to the greatest act of love the world has ever known. If you're feeling the weight of responsibility and the isolation that comes with it, take heart. God has called you to a higher standard for a reason. Your faithfulness in these lonely moments is preparing you for the impact you're going to make. This brings us to another important truth. Solitude is necessary for revelation and growth. Throughout the Bible, we see that God often calls people to seasons of isolation before revealing his greatest plans for their lives. These times of solitude aren't punishment, they're preparation. Think about Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness. Before he began his public ministry, the Holy Spirit led him into the desert, where he fasted and prayed alone. It was during this time of isolation that Jesus overcame temptation and prepared himself for the mission ahead. This period of solitude wasn't wasted. It was essential to his growth and readiness for what was to come. C.S. Lewis reflected on this in A Grief Observed when he wrote, "We were promised sufferings. They were part of the program. We were even told, 'Blessed are they that mourn,' and I accept it. In the same way, many of us are called into seasons of loneliness so that God can do a deep work in us. It's in these quiet, isolated moments that we are stripped of distractions and able to hear God's voice more clearly. It's in solitude that we grow, mature, and receive the revelation we need for the next phase of our journey. For example, think of someone who starts a new business. In the beginning, there are often long hours spent alone, late nights working, while others are asleep, and moments of self-doubt where it feels like no one else understands the vision. But it's in those quiet moments, away from the noise, that ideas are birthed, plans are formed, and breakthroughs happen. The same is true in our spiritual lives. Solitude is where God refines us, shapes us, and prepares us for the tasks ahead. We live in a culture that values busyness and constant connection. We're surrounded by social media, instant messaging, and a never-ending stream of information. But often, it's in disconnecting from the noise that we hear God the loudest. Solitude is where you go to be reminded of who you are and what you're called to do. C.S. Lewis knew the value of stepping away from the chaos when he wrote, "It comes the very moment you wake up each morning. All your wishes and hopes for the day rush at you like wild animals, and the first job each morning consists simply in shoving them all back, in listening to that other voice, taking that other point of view."
Welcome to the Light of C.S. Lewis channel. Please subscribe to the channel to get the latest videos.
Letting that other larger, stronger, quieter life come flowing in. Consider the Apostle Paul. After his dramatic conversion on the road to Damascus, he didn't immediately jump into ministry. Instead, he spent time in the desert, alone with God, before stepping into his role as one of the greatest apostles. That time of isolation was crucial for his growth and preparation. If you're in a season of loneliness right now, know that it's not wasted. God is using this time to grow you, to give you revelation, and to prepare you for the next step. Don't rush the process. Embrace the solitude, knowing that God is working in the quiet places of your life. One of the hardest parts of being chosen by God is dealing with misunderstanding and rejection. When you're walking in your calling, there will be times when people just don't get it. They may reject you, criticize you, or even oppose you simply because they don't understand the vision God has given you. This isn't a new problem. Jesus himself was rejected by the very people he came to save. He was misunderstood by the religious leaders of his day and even by his own disciples at times. But he didn't let that stop him from fulfilling his mission. In fact, he used those moments of rejection to draw closer to the Father and to stay focused on his purpose. C.S. Lewis captured this sentiment in The Problem of Pain. Pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciences, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Rejection often drives us closer to God. In our modern world, rejection can come in many forms. Maybe you've been criticized for pursuing a dream that others don't think is realistic. Or perhaps you've faced opposition for standing up for what you believe in. It's easy to feel discouraged when people reject you, especially when it comes from those closest to you. But remember, rejection is often a sign that you're on the right path. Let's bring this into a real-world example. Consider someone who decides to leave a high-paying corporate job to follow a calling into ministry or to start a non-profit. The world might see this as foolish. Friends and family might question the decision, offering practical reasons why it doesn't make sense. But the person knows deep down that this is what God is calling them to do. The rejection and misunderstanding they face are painful, but they're also a sign that they're stepping into something bigger than themselves. Joseph, as we mentioned earlier, was misunderstood by his brothers and rejected by them. Yet that rejection was part of God's plan to place him in a position of influence in Egypt. What looked like rejection was actually divine redirection. So if you're experiencing rejection right now, don't lose heart. It's part of the journey. God often allows us to go through these seasons to strengthen our resolve and deepen our dependence on him. When others reject you, it's an opportunity to draw closer to God and to trust him more fully with your future. The path to fulfilling God's calling often requires great sacrifice, and sacrifice by its very nature can be lonely. When God calls you to something greater, He often asks you to let go of things that others might hold on to, comfort, relationships, or even personal dreams. Abraham is a prime example of this. God called him to leave his homeland, his family, and everything he knew to go to a land God would show him. That journey must have been incredibly lonely at times. Abraham had to trust God, even when it didn't make sense. He had to sacrifice his comfort and familiarity to step into the unknown. In today's world, this might look like someone who feels called to move to a different country for mission work, leaving behind family, friends, and the life they know. It could be someone who sacrifices their time and energy to serve in ministry, missing out on social events or career advancements because they're committed to a higher purpose. These sacrifices can feel isolating because not everyone will understand why you're making them. But here's the truth. Every sacrifice you make for God is never wasted. Jesus said in Matthew 19:29, "And everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or fields for my sake will receive 100 times as much and will inherit eternal life." God sees every sacrifice, and He promises that what you give up for His sake will be rewarded. The loneliness that comes with sacrifice is temporary, but the reward is eternal. So if you're feeling the weight of sacrifice right now, know that God is with you. He understands your struggle, and He's walking with you through it. Your sacrifice is part of the journey to fulfilling your purpose. One of the final reasons chosen ones experience loneliness is because of the test of faith and patience. When God gives you a vision or a calling, it doesn't always come to pass immediately. There are often long periods of waiting.
Welcome to the Light of C.S. Lewis channel. Please subscribe to the channel to get the latest videos.
Uncertainty and testing that can feel incredibly lonely. Think about David. He was anointed as king when he was just a young shepherd, but it took years before he actually sat on the throne. During that time, he faced persecution, lived in caves, and was constantly on the run from King Saul. It must have been a lonely and confusing season for him. He knew what God had promised, but the waiting tested his faith and patience. In our lives, we often face similar seasons of waiting. Maybe God has given you a vision for something, but it feels like it's taking forever to come to pass. You've been praying, working, and trusting, but the breakthrough hasn't come yet. In those moments, it's easy to feel alone, like God has forgotten you or that your calling will never be fulfilled. But it's important to remember that the waiting is part of the process. God uses these seasons to strengthen our faith and to teach us patience. He's not delaying His promise. He's preparing you for it. During these lonely times, God is building your character and refining you for the next step. The Apostle Paul, after his conversion, spent years in preparation before stepping into his full calling as a missionary. Those years of waiting weren't wasted. They were a time of growth and development that prepared him for the incredible ministry he would have. If you're in a season of waiting right now, don't lose heart. God is with you in the waiting. He's working behind the scenes, even when you can't see it. Your loneliness in this season is not a sign of abandonment. It's a sign of preparation. The surprising truth about loneliness is that it's not a punishment. It's part of God's process for you. The loneliness of chosen ones is not a sign that you've been abandoned or that something is wrong. It's a sign that you're being set apart. God is using your solitude to shape you, to mold you, and to prepare you for the greatness He has in store. If you're feeling alone today, know that you're in good company. Moses, Joseph, David, Jesus, They all walked lonely paths, but those paths led to incredible impact and influence. Your loneliness is not the end of your story. It's just part of the journey to where God is taking you. So embrace your solitude. Trust that God is working in the quiet, lonely moments. He's preparing you for something extraordinary. You are not truly alone. God is with you every step of the way. As C.S. Lewis said, "Courage, dear heart." That courage will carry you through the lonely seasons to the extraordinary purpose God has prepared for you. Thank you for joining me today. If this message has encouraged you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Let's continue walking this path together, trusting that God is with us, even in the loneliness.